Around 980 AD, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark had a problem. His newly unified kingdom was restless. Their power was fragile. Threats came not just from across the sea, but from ambitious chieftains within his own lands. He needed control. He needed a way to project power and put down rebellions before they even started. His solution was not a fleet or a roving army. It was architecture. He ordered the construction of a series of massive ring forts. One of them was Trelleborg. The fort was a perfect circle. Its main rampart was enormous, nearly 60 feet thick at the base and 16 feet high, built from earth and timber. 4 gates, one at each point of the compass, pierced the rampart. They led to 2 timber-paved roads that crossed precisely in the center. Inside, the space was divided into 4 perfect quadrants. Each quadrant held 4 identical longhouses arranged in a square. 16 longhouses in total. From the air, it looked like a geometric diagram. This was no simple defensive wall. The precision was military. It was a barracks, a command center, and a symbol of the new order. The forts were not built on the coast to repel foreign raiders. They were built inland along key land and river routes. They were designed to control the Danes themselves. A local chieftain thinking of rebellion would have to consider the professional soldiers garrisoned in the nearby ring fort, ready to march at a moment's notice. Harald Bluetooth showed that the greatest defense was sometimes a projection of overwhelming internal strength, a way to stop a fight before it ever began. His forts were a message written in earth and wood, and the message was simple: the king is watching. Number 16. The land itself is your first wall. Astrid didn't have enough men to build a fort. She didn't even have a husband anymore. Eric had sailed west with 12 men from their fjord in 795 AD and had not returned. Now it was 798 AD, and she was left with 2 young sons, an old farmhand named Kalf, and a handful of thralls. Her farm sat on a small patch of green land jutting out into the sea on Norway's coast. It was a good farm, with enough pasture for 12 cows and a flock of sheep. That made it a target. Other longships passed their fjord, some carried traders, others carried men who saw a farm run by a woman as an easy meal. Astrid's father had taught her to read the land. He was a hunter, and he understood that the shape of a hill or the curve of a river could mean the difference between life and death. When she and Eric chose the spot for their longhouse, it was not for the view, it was for its defensibility. The farm was a small peninsula. On 3 sides, steep, rocky cliffs dropped 50 feet straight to the churning sea. There was no beach, no place for a ship to land. Anyone who wanted to reach their farm had to come from the east by land. This created a bottleneck. A single path, no wider than 2 carts, led from the mainland onto their patch of earth. This was the only way in or out. They built their longhouse and their barns behind a low stone wall that spanned this narrow neck of land. The wall was not tall, maybe only to a man's chest, but it didn't need to be. It was a barrier that would force any attacker to slow down, to bunch up. One evening in late summer, a ship did not pass by. It anchored in a cove a mile down the coast. Calf saw it from the high cliff where he watched the sheep. He ran back to the longhouse, his old legs surprisingly fast. He did not need to shout. The look on his face was enough. Astrid sent one of the thralls to a neighboring farm, a half-hour run away, to ask for help. Then she, Calf, and her 2 sons, who were only 10 and 12, picked up their weapons. A woodsman's axe for Calf, an old spear for herself. The boys had knives. They did not wait in the longhouse. They went to the low stone wall. It was dusk. About 20 men came walking up the path. They were not walking like an army. They were casual, laughing. They expected an empty farm, a few terrified servants. They saw a woman, an old man, and 2 boys standing behind a wall, holding weapons. The raiders stopped. The laughter died. The path was narrow. The wall meant they could not just swarm the defenders. They would have to come over the top, maybe 2 or 3 at a time. The first man to try would face a spear. The second would face an axe. It was still a poor matchup. But it was not the easy fight they had expected. Or they would take injuries, maybe a man or two would die, and for what? Some stored grain, a few cows. While they were busy fighting at the wall, the help Astrid had summoned could be on its way. The leader of the raiders looked at the cliffs. He looked at the sea, he looked at the single path blocked by the wall. He cursed he had not signed up for a real fight. He waved his men back. They walked back down the path, grumbling. They got in their ship and sailed away. Astrid and her family stood at the wall until the ship was just a speck on the horizon. They had not swung a single weapon. The land had fought for them. The cliffs were their walls. The narrow path was their gate. By choosing their home wisely, they had made their tiny force seem stronger than it was. Number 15, a good dog hears trouble before a man sees it. Rolf's farm in Iceland was isolated. It was the year 10 AD. He lived in a valley carved by a glacier thousands of years before. The next farm was a 2-hour walk away. In Iceland, the threats were not foreign raiders. The threats were your neighbors. And, a dispute over a single sheep could fester for a generation, ending in a bloody feud. Rolf was a successful farmer. He had more sheep and better cattle than his neighbor to the north, a sour man named Grim. Rolf knew his prosperity made him a target. He did not have a wall around his farmstead. Timber was scarce in Iceland, and building a stone wall around his entire property was impossible. His defense was alive. It had 4 legs, a thick coat of fur, and teeth. He had 3 dogs. They were not pets. They were not companions in the modern sense. They were a vital part of the farm security system. They were a breed the first settlers had brought from Norway, the ancestors of the modern Icelandic sheepdog. They were bred for 2 things, herding sheep and barking. His lead dog was named Scully. He slept not in the barn, but on a pile of furs just inside the door of the longhouse. No one could approach the house at night without Scully knowing. The other 2 dogs roamed the property. Their job was to guard the sheep from foxes, but their real value was as an early warning system. Their hearing was far better than any humans. They could hear the sound of men walking on turf from hundreds of yards away. One night, Grim decided to act. He was not going to kill Rolf. He was going to burn his hay barn. Without hay for the winter, Rolf's cattle would starve. Ruin him. Grim and his 2 grown sons crept out of their own longhouse after midnight. They carried torches unlit. The moon was a sliver hidden by clouds. The valley was silent. They were still a quarter of a mile from Rolf's property when one of the dogs sleeping among the sheep lifted its head. It let out a low growl. The second dog heard it and stood up, its ears pricked. As Grim and his sons crossed the small stream that marked the boundary of Rolf's land, the first dog began to bark. It was not a friendly bark. It was a sharp, frantic alarm. The second dog joined in from a different part of the field. Inside the longhouse, Scully shot up from his sleep. He ran to the door, letting out a deep, guttural bark that echoed off the timber walls. Rolf was awake instantly. He grabbed the spear that always leaned against the wall next to his bed. His own sons were already stirring. He knew the barks. He knew the difference between the bark for a fox and the bark for a person. This was the bark for people. Grim and his sons heard the barking. They heard the big dog inside the house join the chorus. The element of surprise was gone. Rolf and his family were awake and armed. Continuing the attack would mean a real fight in the dark against men who knew they were coming. Grim was a thief, not a warrior. He swore under his breath and signaled for his sons to retreat. They slipped back into the darkness, their plan foiled. Rolf stood by his door for an hour, listening. The dogs slowly quieted down. He never saw Grim. He had no proof. But he knew what had almost happened. The next day, he gave his dogs extra portions of meat. They had not bitten anyone, and as they had not fought, they had simply made a noise. But that noise was a more effective defense than a stone wall. It had turned a silent, easy attack into a loud, risky one, and that was enough to keep his family safe. Number 14, hide what you cannot defend. The Orkney Islands were a busy place in 950 AD. Ships from Norway, Ireland, and beyond passed through, trading, raiding, and settling. For a farmer like Magnus, this was both a blessing and a curse. It meant there were markets for his wool and cheese. It also meant there were always strangers about, and not all of them were friendly. His farm was small, just a single longhouse, a barn, and a few fields on the island of Ruzay. He did not have the men to defend it against a determined group of raiders. He knew he could lose his livestock. He could lose his stored grain, but what he feared losing most were the things that could not be replaced. His wife's silver brooches, passed down from her grandmother, a small hoard of silver coins he had saved from years of trading. The tools his father had made. These were his family's wealth, their security for the future. If a raid came, he and his family could flee to the hills, but they could not carry all their valuables with them. So Magnus used a strategy of concealment. He did not build a treasure chest with a strong lock. A chest could be broken open or carried away. Instead, he made his valuables disappear under the stone-paved floor of his longhouse. In the corner where the dairy tools were kept was a large, flat flagstone. It looked like all the others, but Magnus could use a metal pry bar to lift it. Beneath it was a small stone-lined pit about 3 feet deep. This was his souterrain, his earth house. It was not a place to live. It was damp and dark. It was a place to hide things. When a suspicious-looking ship was spotted in the bay, Magnus's wife would gather the silver, the best clothes, and a few valuable tools. She would wrap them in oilcloth to protect them from the damp and lower them into the pit. Magnus would then replace the heavy flagstone. He would kick some dirt and straw over it to make it look undisturbed. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. One day the warning came too late. A dozen men from a passing ship were already walking up the path to his farm. Magnus had no time to hide. He told his family to run for the hills behind the farm while he went to meet the men. He knew resistance was futile. He tried to look poor and humble. The leader of the raiders shoved him aside, and they ransacked the longhouse. They took some dried fish and a sack of barley. They looked for valuables, kicking over furniture and pulling furs off the beds. Yeah, they found nothing. They walked right over the flagstone in the corner, never suspecting what lay beneath. They complained about the poor farm, took a few of his sheep from the field, and left. Magnus lost his sheep and some food. It was a hard blow. But when he returned to the longhouse and lifted the stone, his real wealth was safe. The silver was still there, the tools were there. He had not defended his property with weapons, he had defended it with ingenuity. He understood a simple truth. An enemy cannot steal what an enemy cannot find. All across the Viking world, from Scotland to Ireland, farmers used similar methods. They dug small hidden cellars under their homes or in nearby fields. These were not grand treasure vaults. There were simple holes in the ground, a practical defense for ordinary people who had something to lose and no other way to protect it. Number 13, your house is your castle. Leif was a carpenter. He lived in the settlement of Hedeby around 870 AD. Hedeby was one of the largest towns in the Viking world, a bustling hub of trade and craft. It was also crowded and dangerous. It had a large defensive rampart surrounding it, but the real threats were often inside the walls. A drunken brawl could turn into a riot. A trade dispute could lead to an armed standoff. A house could be a target for thieves at night. And Leif's house was his workshop and his home. It was built like most others in the town, a long, rectangular building of timber and wattle and daub. But Leif had built his with defense in mind. He was not a rich chieftain. He could not build a stone fortress, but he could make his simple house a very difficult place to attack. His first principle was to limit access. The house had only one door. It was made of thick oak planks, 2 layers deep, held together with iron nails he had forged himself. The door did not swing on leather hinges. It pivoted on a massive wooden post that sat in a stone socket in the floor and a timber frame at the top. This made it incredibly difficult to break down. From the inside, it could be barred with a heavy timber beam that slid into stone-lined holes in the wall on either side. When that bar was in place, the door was as strong as the wall itself. The house had no windows on the ground floor. The light came from the smoke hole in the roof and from lamps. This was common, but Leif made a point of keeping his walls solid. A window was a weak point, a place an attacker could climb through or shoot an arrow through. The construction of the walls was also defensive. The main vertical posts were deeply set in the ground, the wattle and daub infill, a mesh of woven branches covered in clay and dung, could be broken through with an axe, but Leif had built his so that every few feet there was a heavy timber post. An attacker might break a hole in the wall, but they would find themselves blocked by a thick piece of oak. They could not just swarm in. One night, a dispute with a rival craftsman boiled over. The man, named Canute, had accused Leif of stealing a design for a carved chair. After a day of drinking, Canute and 3 of his friends decided to teach Leif a lesson. They came to his house late at night, armed with clubs and axes. They tried the door first. They threw their shoulders against it. It didn't budge. They tried to smash it with an axe. The thick oak splintered, but held. The noise woke Leif and his family. Leif slid the heavy bar across the door and grabbed his own axe. Frustrated, Canute's men tried to break through the wall. They hacked at the wattle and daub. Chunks of dried clay and straw fell away, revealing the woven branches inside. They broke through the wattle, creating a hole, but the hole was blocked by one of the main timber posts. They could not make the opening any wider. One of them tried to squeeze through, and Leif was waiting on the other side with his axe. The man pulled back with a yell, his arm cut. The commotion had attracted the attention of the town watch. Hearing their approach, Canute and his men fled. Leif's house was damaged. He would have to spend a day repairing the wall. But his family was safe. He had not outfought his attackers. His house had done it for him. He had used his skills as a carpenter to turn his home into a small, personal fortress. The design was simple, but it was based on a sound defensive principle. A strong door and solid walls could defeat most casual attacks. For an ordinary person, that was often enough. Number 12, a thorny bush, is a patient guard. The Danish countryside in the 9th century was a patchwork of small farms and villages. For a farmer like Gunnar, life was a constant struggle against the weather, crop failure, and, sometimes, other people. His farm was not on a cliff or an island. It was in a flat, open area, easily accessible from all sides. He could not build a large palisade. He didn't have the timber or the manpower, but he needed a way to protect his livestock and keep casual wanderers from his longhouse. Gunnar used a defense that was alive and grew stronger every year. He planted hedges, not small, decorative hedges, but massive, thick barriers of thorny plants. He used hawthorn and blackthorn, native bushes known for their dense growth and viciously sharp spines. This was not a quick solution. It took years of work. He started by digging a shallow ditch around the perimeter of his main farmstead, encompassing his house, barn, and a small pasture. He then built a low bank of earth on the inside of the ditch with the excavated soil. On top of this bank, he planted young saplings of hawthorn and blackthorn, packing them closely together. For the first few years, the hedge was not much of a barrier. It was just a line of small, spindly bushes. But Gunnar tended to it carefully. He would weave the young branches together, a technique called pleaching. He would cut partway through a branch and bend it down, encouraging it to grow horizontally and create a dense, tangled mesh. As the years passed, the hedge grew into a formidable obstacle. It was over 6 feet tall and just as thick. The interwoven branches were as strong as a wooden fence, and the dense thorns made it impossible to climb through without being seriously torn up. The hedge served multiple purposes. It kept his own cattle from wandering off. It acted as a windbreak, protecting his crops and buildings. But its main purpose was defense. Any thief or raider wanting to get to his livestock would first have to deal with the hedge. They could not simply walk through it. They could not easily climb over it. They would have to spend time and make a lot of noise cutting a path through it with axes. One evening, a small group of desperate men, their own farms having failed, decided to raid Gunnar's cattle pen. They came at night, hoping to drive off a few cows without being noticed. They reached the edge of Gunnar's property and ran into the hedge. They had expected a simple fence. This was a living wall. They tried to find a weak spot, but there was none. They tried to push through, but the thorns tore at their clothes and skin. They took out their axes and began to chop at the branches. The noise of splintering wood and cursing men carried easily in the still night air. Gunnar's dogs started barking. Gunnar himself woke up, grabbed a pitchfork, and went outside. He saw the figures hacking at his hedge. He did not have to fight them. He just had to wait. The hedge was doing the fighting for him. It was slowing them down, making noise, and giving him time. The raiders knew they had lost the element of surprise. They had barely made a dent in the thicket of thorns. They gave up, melting back into the darkness. Gunnar's hedge was scratched and dented, but it had held. It was a defense that fed itself from the soil, that repaired itself, and that grew stronger with each passing season. It was a slow, patient, and incredibly effective strategy for a farmer who had more time than timber. Number 11 fire is a weapon that fights for both sides. Sigrid's farm was located in the Swedish archipelago around 900 AD. Her husband was a trader, often away for months at a time. The farm was on a small island, connected to the larger mainland by a narrow wooden bridge he had built. This bridge was their main defensive feature. If a threat appeared, they could destroy the bridge, isolating themselves on the island. But destroying a bridge took time and was a last resort. Sigrid had a more subtle method of defense. At each end of the bridge, on her island and on the mainland side, she kept a pile of dry tinder and wood. Next to it, in a small sheltered stone niche, she kept fire-starting tools of fire steel, flint, and dried fungus. Her plan was not to burn the bridge to stop an enemy. Her plan was to use fire and smoke as a screen. The Viking longhouse was a notoriously smoky place. The central hearth had no chimney, only a hole in the roof. People were used to smoke. They understood its properties. It could sting the eyes, choke the lungs, and, most importantly, create confusion. One summer afternoon, a longship full of unfamiliar men landed on the mainland coast. They were not traders. Their shields were hung on the side of the ship, a sign of hostile intent. They began to march towards Sigrid's farm. She saw them from the island. She had only 3 farmhands with her. They were no match for the 30 men approaching. She did not panic. She sent one of the farmhands to get the livestock into the barn. She and the other 2 ran to the bridge. They did not try to dismantle it. Instead, they lit the piles of wood at both ends. The wood was mixed with damp leaves and green branches she had prepared for this purpose. It did not create a clean, hot fire. It created a massive amount of thick, acrid smoke. The wind was blowing from the island towards the mainland. The smoke from the fire on her side of the bridge billowed across the water, engulfing the bridge and the path leading to it. The raiders, who had been jogging confidently towards the farm, were forced to stop. They could not see the other side. The bridge had disappeared into a gray-black cloud. They did not know what was waiting for them in the smoke. Was it just a fire, or were there men with bows waiting to shoot them as they choked and stumbled across the bridge? The smoke was a physical barrier. It made it hard to breathe and impossible to see. It turned a simple charge into a blind, dangerous gamble. The leader of the raiders hesitated. He did not want to send his men into an ambush. He shouted threats across the water, but his voice was lost in the crackle of the flames. Sigrid and her men did not shout back. They remained silent, hidden by the smoke screen they had created. This uncertainty unnerved the attackers. An enemy you can see is one you can fight. An enemy you cannot see is terrifying. After a few minutes of indecision, the raiders gave up. The risk was too great for the potential reward of a small island farm. They turned around and marched back to their ship. Sigrid and her men kept the smoke fires burning until the ship was gone. She had used one of the Vikings' most feared weapons, fire, not for destruction, but for concealment. She showed that a defense did not have to be a solid wall. A barrier of smoke and fear could be just as effective. Number 10. Sometimes the best defense is a good neighbor. Bjorn lived in a small farming community in the Danish interior around 1050 AD. This was a time of change. The great raiding expeditions were becoming less common. The power of kings and centralized government was growing. But for an ordinary farmer, life was still precarious. The biggest threat was not a foreign fleet, but a local dispute that got out of hand, or a band of lawless men roaming the countryside. Bjorn's farm was not naturally defensible. He was not a great warrior. He did not have many weapons. His greatest defensive asset was his relationship with his neighbors. His farm was part of a small cluster of 5 homesteads. They were close enough that a shout from one could be heard at the next. Over the years, the families had developed a system of mutual defense based on trust and a formal oath. They had sworn their oath at the local thing, the governing assembly, in front of witnesses. The oath was simple. If one farm was attacked, the others would come to its aid. This was not just a friendly agreement, it was a binding contract. To break it would bring shame and legal consequences. To make the system work, they had an alarm. In the center of the cluster of farms, on a small rise, they had erected a tall pole. At the top of the pole was an iron triangle and a metal hammer. If a farm was in trouble, the first person to see the threat would run to the pole and strike the triangle. The loud clanging sound would carry across the fields, a clear signal that was different from any normal farm noise. One autumn, a group of about 15 men, mercenaries who had been dismissed by a local lord, decided to prey on the farming communities. They were professional soldiers, well armed and ruthless. They picked Bjorn's farm as their first target. They approached in the late afternoon, confident that a single farmer and his family would be no match for them. Bjorn's son, who was herding geese in a nearby field, saw them coming. He did not run to the longhouse. He ran straight for the alarm pole. He grabbed the hammer and began striking the iron triangle with all his might. The clear, urgent clang rang out through the valley. At the other 4 farms, people stopped what they were doing. They heard the alarm. The men grabbed their axes, spears, and hunting bows. They did not hesitate. They did not stop to ask what the problem was. They ran towards the sound. They ran towards Bjorn's farm. The mercenaries were surprised by the noise. They were even more surprised when, just a few minutes later, men started appearing from all directions. They had expected to fight one farmer. Now they were facing more than a dozen. The farmers were not professional soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes and their neighbors. They knew the land. They used trees and fences for cover. The leader of the mercenaries quickly assessed the situation. This was not the easy plunder he had envisioned. This was going to be a real bloody fight. His men might win, but they would take casualties. It was not worth it. He gave the order to retreat. They left without taking anything. Bjorn's farm was safe. He had not defeated the attackers by himself. His community had defeated them. Their strength was not in walls or weapons, but in their numbers and their oath. They had created a defensive system where the whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. An attack on one was an attack on all. This social defense was often more resilient than any physical one. Number 9, a hidden weapon is better than a locked door. Ketil was a blacksmith in a village on the coast of a Norwegian fjord in the year 920 AD. His forge was his life. He made nails, tools, axe heads, and sometimes, if a customer paid well, a sword. Because of his trade, he was wealthier than most of his neighbors. He had silver, valuable tools and a stock of precious iron. This made his home and workshop a tempting target for thieves. His house was sturdy, but he knew any determined thief could eventually break through a door or a wall. His most valuable defense was not in what was visible, but in what was hidden. He had created a series of clever weapon caches throughout his property. This was a common practice. Vikings did not store all their weapons in one place. They kept them close at hand, ready for immediate use. His best sword was not on a rack on the wall. It was wrapped in an oiled cloth and hidden inside a hollowed-out beam in the roof of his longhouse. Only he knew how to get it down. A spear was not leaning in a corner. It was disassembled, the head and shaft hidden separately under the floorboards in his sleeping area. By his forge, what looked like a simple woodpile was actually a carefully constructed cache. Behind the top logs, there was a hollow space containing 2 axes and a shield. Even the long handle of his forge bellows was not what it seemed. It could be unscrewed to reveal a long, sharp dagger inside. This strategy was based on the idea of surprise. An intruder might break into his house. They would see a sleeping family seemingly defenseless. They would not see the weapons that were only an arm's reach away. One night, 2 men who had been working on a trading ship in the fjord decided to rob the blacksmith. They had seen the silver he used in trade. They forced the lock on his workshop door and crept inside. They thought Ketil and his family would be asleep in the main longhouse, which was connected to the forge. They began to search for his strongbox. As they did, Ketil, who had been awakened by the sound, slipped out of his bed. He did not confront them immediately. He moved silently to the main hearth. He reached up and slid a small wooden panel, dislodging the hidden sword from the beam above. It fell silently into his waiting hands. His wife, meanwhile, retrieved the spearhead and shaft from under the floor and quickly assembled them. The thieves found the strongbox and were trying to pry it open. Suddenly, Ketil was there, standing in the doorway between the house and the forge, holding a sword. He was not supposed to be armed. They had only a club and a knife between them. They were startled. As they hesitated, his wife appeared behind him holding the spear. The thieves were now facing 2 armed people in a confined space. Their plan of a quick, quiet robbery had gone wrong. They dropped the strongbox and fled out the door they had broken. They ran into the night. Ketil did not pursue them. He did not need to. His hidden weapons had allowed him to turn a moment of extreme vulnerability into a position of strength. He had armed himself and his wife in seconds, completely changing the dynamic of the encounter. The best lock could be broken, but a surprise weapon in a defender's hand was an argument that few thieves were willing to have. Number 8, make them think you are weaker than you are. And Ulf's farm was on the Danish island of Funen in the late 10th century. It was a time of conflict between local chieftains. Sir Ulf was a successful farmer, but he was not allied with any of the powerful families. This made him independent, but also vulnerable. His farm was well run, his barns were full, and his longhouse was in good repair. It looked prosperous. And prosperity attracted predators. Ulf could not hide his farm. He could not afford a large group of hired guards, so he adopted a strategy of misdirection. He decided to make his farm look poorer and less inviting than it actually was. It was a calculated act of deception. The longhouse itself was his main tool. The turf roof was deliberately left untrimmed and overgrown, with weeds sprouting from it. A well-maintained turf roof was a sign of a diligent, and likely wealthy, owner. Ulf's looked neglected. The timber walls, which were structurally sound, were not cleaned. He allowed dirt and grime to accumulate on the wood, making it look older and more weathered than it was. The fence around his main yard was a work of art in its shabbiness. It was strong, with deep-set posts, but Ulf had intentionally used mismatched and weathered pieces of wood. A few sections were made to look broken and poorly repaired, even though they were secure. He left a broken, useless cart near the main gate. To any passerby, the farm looked like it was on the verge of failing. His livestock was harder to hide, but he managed. His best, fattest cattle were kept in a pasture behind the farm, out of sight from the main road. The animals that were visible in the front field were older, scrawnier ones. This deception was a constant effort. It went against a farmer's pride. But Ulf understood it was a form of defense. A raiding party or a group of a chieftain's men looking for supplies would often have a choice of targets. They would be drawn to the farm that looked the most promising, the one that suggested the biggest reward for the risk. Ulf's farm did not look promising. It looked like it had already been picked clean. The strategy was tested one summer. A local chieftain, Ivar, was gathering men and supplies for a feud with a rival. He sent a group of his warriors to collect a tax from the independent farmers in the area. The warriors rode through the countryside, assessing the farms. They passed Ulf's homestead. They saw the overgrown roof, the dilapidated fence, the scrawny cows. The leader of the group scoffed. "Nothing to be had there," he said. They can barely feed themselves. They rode on, heading for the next farm down the road, which had a neatly trimmed roof and a well-maintained fence. They ended up taking half of that farmer's grain stores. Ulf, watching from a slit in his barn wall, felt a quiet sense of relief. His pride was a small price to pay for his security. By making himself appear to be a less valuable target, he had avoided a confrontation he could not have won. It was a psychological defense. He was not defending his property with walls or weapons, but with a carefully crafted illusion of poverty. He had made his farm invisible by hiding it in plain sight. Number 7, the watchtower sees a threat when it is still just a sail on the horizon. The coastline of Norway is a maze of fjords, islands, and hidden coves. For the communities living there in the 9th century, the sea was both a highway for trade and a constant source of danger. A ship appearing on the horizon could be a friend, or it could be a raider coming to burn, kill, and steal. The key to survival was early warning. A 5-minute warning was the difference between being caught unprepared in your home and being ready with weapons in hand. A 30-minute warning was the difference between a fight and having enough time to flee to a safer, more defensible location. In a fjord where Halfdan was a chieftain, the community had built a system of watchtowers and beacons. This was a collective defense organized by the chieftain but manned by all the free farmers of the area. On the outermost point of land where the fjord met the open sea, they had built a simple watchtower. It was not a stone castle, it was a wooden platform about 20 feet high, built on the highest cliff. It offered a commanding view of the sea approaches. 2 men were on watch at all times. The duty rotated among the farms. It was a tedious job. Most days they saw nothing but fishing boats and gulls, but they understood its importance. Next to the watchtower was a large pile of dry wood and brush, kept under a hide cover to protect it from the rain. This was the beacon. Further down the fjord, on other strategic headlands, were more beacon piles. Each one was visible to the next, forming a chain that led all the way to the main settlement at the fjord's end. One clear summer morning, the watchman on the tower saw it. A single longship, low in the water, oars out, moving fast. It was not a local trading vessel. It had the high prow and shields along the gunwale of a warship. He did not wait to see who it was, and he and his partner immediately lit the beacon. As the smoke began to billow up, the men at the next beacon station down the fjord saw it. They did not need to wait for instructions. They lit their own beacon. Within 10 minutes, a chain of smoke signals had traveled 20 miles down the fjord. In Halfdan's main settlement, a man posted on the hill behind the longhouses saw the smoke from the final beacon. He blew a loud, long blast on a cow horn. The sound of the horn galvanized the village. The normal, peaceful activity of the day stopped instantly. Women gathered their children and valuable items and headed for a pre-arranged hiding place, a narrow, easily defended ravine high in the hills behind the settlement. Men ran to the longhouses to grab their shields, spears, and axes. By the time the raiders' ship rounded the final bend in the fjord, the village below looked deserted. There were no people, no livestock. The raiders landed on the beach, expecting to find a sleepy village full of easy plunder. Instead, they found an empty settlement. As they cautiously moved between the buildings, Halfdan and his 60 men appeared on the ridge above them. They were not trapped in their homes. They were in a prepared defensive position looking down on the attackers. The leader of the raiders saw that the situation was hopeless. The element of surprise, his greatest weapon, was gone. He was now facing an organized, prepared defense in a location chosen by the defenders. He ordered his men back to the ship. They had sailed for 2 days to get here, and they left with nothing. The watchtower and beacon system had worked perfectly. It was a simple technology, just wood, fire, and smoke. But it was a highly effective information network. It had bought the defenders the one thing they needed most time to hide their families, time to arm themselves, and time to choose the battlefield. Number 6, a swamp is a moat made by nature. The village of Torkel was in a part of Jutland in modern-day Denmark that was marshy and flat. It was the year 880 AD. There were no hills or cliffs to use for defense. Building a large wooden palisade was difficult, as the soft ground did not provide a good foundation for tall posts. The villagers needed a different kind of defense, one suited to their unique environment. Their solution was to use the water itself. They had built their village on a small island of solid ground in the middle of a vast swamp. The swamp was a treacherous place. It was a maze of deep pools of stagnant water hidden by reeds and green scum. There were thick patches of mud that could suck a man down to his waist. Only a few narrow, winding paths of solid ground snaked through the marsh, and their locations were a closely guarded secret known only to the villagers. To anyone unfamiliar with the area, the swamp was a deadly, impassable barrier. It was a natural moat, far more effective than one a man could dig. To make it even more defensible, the villagers had built a single causeway. It was a narrow path, raised above the water level, made of sunken logs and packed earth. It was just wide enough for a single cart to pass. This causeway was their only link to the outside world, and it was their primary defensive choke point. Where the causeway met their island, they had built a simple wooden gatehouse. It was not a fortress, just a sturdy gate with a platform above it, where two men with spears or bows could stand. One year, a dispute with a neighboring clan turned violent. The other clan, led by a man named Sten, decided to attack Torkel's village. Sten gathered about 80 men and marched to the edge of the swamp. They saw the village in the distance, seemingly unprotected. They saw the single causeway leading to it. Sten was arrogant. He ordered his men to charge across the causeway and storm the gate. As the first 20 men ran onto the narrow path, Torkel's defenders opened fire. They did not have many bows, but they had piles of rocks. From the gatehouse platform and from the banks on either side, they hurled stones at the attackers. The causeway became a death trap. The men were bunched together, easy targets. They could not spread out. If a man was hit and fell, he blocked the path for those behind him. Some were knocked off the causeway into the deep, cold water of the marsh. Their heavy wool clothes and leather boots dragged them down. A few of Sten's men tried to be clever. They left the causeway and tried to wade through the swamp to attack the village from the side. This was a fatal mistake. They did not know the safe paths. Within moments, they were floundering in deep mud, easy targets for the defenders on the shore. The other attackers saw this and refused to leave the causeway. Sten's charge faltered. His men were trapped on the narrow path, taking casualties and unable to effectively fight back. The psychological effect of the swamp was huge. The fear of drowning in the murky water or sinking in the mud was as great a weapon as any spear. After losing a dozen men and making no progress, Sten ordered a retreat. The villagers had won a decisive victory without suffering a single loss. They had not outfought their enemies. They had let the landscape do the fighting for them. Their knowledge of the treacherous swamp was their greatest weapon. They had turned a feature that made farming difficult into their most formidable defense. Number 5. The shield wall is a fortress made of men. It was 1066, a year of chaos and war. Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, had invaded England. With him was a Viking named Olav. Olav was not a king or a great chieftain. He was a veteran warrior, a homesteader from the Trondheim region. He was part of the king's army, but the defensive principles he used in battle were the same ones he would use to defend his own community back home. The core of this defense was the shield wall. The shield wall was the ultimate expression of Viking communal defense. It was simple in concept. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping. The front rank formed a solid barrier of wood and iron. The men behind them used long spears, stabbing over the top of the wall at the enemy. It was not a tactic for individual heroes. It was a tactic that relied on discipline, courage, and trust in the man standing next to you. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Norwegian army was caught by surprise by the English. They had left their armor behind with their ships. They had only their shields, helmets, and weapons. They were outnumbered. Their only chance was to form a defensive circle, a shield wall, bent back on itself on a small hill, and Olav found his place in the line. He pressed his left shoulder against the man next to him, a farmer he knew from the next valley over. He angled his shield so its edge covered his neighbor's right side. His neighbor did the same for him. The shields interlocked, creating a solid wall. The sound of the English army approaching was a roar, the thud of thousands of feet on the ground. The English cavalry charged first. The horses shied away from the wall of shields and the hedge of spear points. They could not break the line. The English infantry crashed into them next. Olav braced himself, planting his feet. An English axe smashed into his shield, the force of the blow jarring his entire arm. He held his ground. To his right, a spearman from behind him lunged forward, stabbing an Englishman who was trying to push through the gap between shields. The fight became a brutal, grinding affair. The shield wall was not a static defense, it was a living thing. If a man fell, the one behind him would step forward to take his place, pulling the fallen man's shield into position. It required immense physical stamina. Olav's shield arm ached. Sweat stung his eyes. The noise was a constant din of screaming men and clashing steel. For hours the wall held. It gave the lightly armored Norwegians a chance to fight against a superior force. It turned a chaotic battlefield into a controlled space. Inside the wall there was order. Outside there was the enemy. The wall was a fortress made of flesh, wood, and iron. It was a defense that a community could take with them anywhere. The same principle applied back in Norway. If a community was threatened by raiders, they would not hide in their individual longhouses. They would gather in an open space, the strongest men forming a shield wall to protect the women and children behind them. Every free man owned a shield and a spear. It was the militia system of its day. At Stamford Bridge, the Norwegian shield wall eventually broke. The English army was too large, and the Norwegians were too far from their supplies. Olav, like his king, fell on that field. But the shield wall itself had worked. It had allowed a surprised and outnumbered army to hold off a superior force for hours. It was a testament to a defensive strategy that relied not on stone or earth, but on the disciplined courage of ordinary men standing together. Number 4, the law can be a sharper sword than steel. The year is 965 AD. The place is the Althing, the great annual assembly of Iceland. It is held in a dramatic natural amphitheater of rock and turf. For 2 weeks in the summer, free men from all over the island gather here to make laws, settle disputes, and trade. For a man like Gunnar of Flidarendi, a famous chieftain and warrior, the Althing was a different kind of battlefield. It was a place where conflicts could be resolved without bloodshed. The law itself was a defensive strategy. Gunnar was a man who attracted trouble. His prowess as a warrior made him respected, but his prosperity made others jealous. And he, was involved in a complex feud with a neighboring chieftain named Otkell. The dispute had started over a trivial matter of grazing rights, but had escalated. Men had been killed on both sides. The cycle of revenge killings, a common feature of Icelandic society, was threatening to consume both families. Gunnar could have continued the feud. He was a better fighter than Otkell and had more allies. He likely would have won a physical confrontation. But winning would have meant more dead men, more widows, and a legacy of bitterness that would last for generations. It would also have left him vulnerable to revenge attacks from Otkell's relatives. Instead, Gunnar chose to use the law. He brought his case against Otkell to the Althing. This was a complex process. There was no police force or public prosecutor. A man had to prosecute his own case. He had to gather witnesses, present evidence, and follow intricate legal procedures. He needed a deep knowledge of the law or the help of someone who did. Gunnar, with the help of his cunning friend Njal, laid out his case. He argued that Otkell had been the aggressor, that his own actions had been in self-defense, and that he was seeking a legal settlement to end the bloodshed. The case was debated in the Law Council, the Assembly's court. Chieftains from all over the country listened to the arguments. Otkell tried to defend himself, but Gunnar and Njal had prepared their case too well. They had witnesses to Otkell's initial provocations. They had evidence that Otkell's men had struck the first blow. The judgment went in Gunnar's favor. The court declared Otkell an outlaw. This was a devastating verdict. An outlaw lost all his property and all legal protections. Anyone could kill him without facing any penalty. Otkel was ruined, his power broken, and Gunnar had not had to lift a sword to achieve it. He had used the social structure of the Althing as his weapon. By winning a legal victory, he not only defeated his enemy, but also gained the support of the community. He was seen as a reasonable man who had respected the law, while Otkel was seen as a troublemaker who had gotten what he deserved. This was a powerful form of defense. It defended not just a man's life and property, but his reputation and his standing in society. It allowed conflicts to be resolved with a finality that a simple battle could not provide. A victory in a feud just invited more attacks. A victory at the Althing was a judgment backed by the entire community. While the Viking Age is often remembered for its violence, its sophisticated legal systems were one of the most ingenious defensive strategies its people developed to protect themselves from the chaos of endless private warfare. Number 3. A shared fleet defends 100 shores. The coast of Vestfold in Norway was a wealthy region in the 10th century. It was also vulnerable. Its many farms and trading posts were prime targets for raiders from Denmark or the eastern Baltic. No single village or chieftain had the resources to maintain a fleet of warships large enough to patrol the entire coastline. The defense had to be a shared one. The system they used was the ledong. The ledong was a system of naval conscription. The entire coastline was divided into districts. Each district was responsible for providing one warship, fully crewed and supplied, when called upon by the king or the local chieftains. A man named Eric was a farmer in one of these districts. He was not a full-time sailor or warrior. He was a farmer. But he, like every able-bodied freeman, had an obligation under the ledang. His district was made up of about 40 farms. Together, these farms had funded the construction of a longship, a small warship with 20 pairs of oars. The ship was kept in a boathouse on the local chieftain's land. Every man in the district was assigned a place on the ship. Eric was an oarsman. He had to provide his own shield, spear, and axe. The wealthier farmers were responsible for providing food for the crew for a set period, usually 2 or 3 months. This system created a massive naval reserve force. While the king might only have a small number of professional warriors in his personal retinue, he could, in a time of crisis, call up hundreds of ships and thousands of men. The call was sent out via a message system. A carved wooden arrow, the war arrow, would be carried from farm to farm. When a farmer received it, he had to drop whatever he was doing, grab his weapons, and go to the designated muster point. One spring, word came that a large fleet of Danish raiders was sailing north, plundering as it went. The war arrow came to Eric's farm. He said goodbye to his family, took his weapons from the wall, and ran to the chieftain's harbor. All over the district, other men were doing the same. Within a day, their ship was launched, its crew assembled. They rowed out to join the other ships from their region. Soon, a fleet of over 30 longships had gathered. This was the regional ledang fleet. They were not a professional navy, but a militia of farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen. But they knew how to fight, and they were defending their own homes. The fleet did not wait for the Danes to attack their farms. They sailed south to intercept them. They found the Danish fleet in a wide bay in the process of raiding a coastal village. The Danes were caught by surprise. They had expected to face only local, disorganized resistance. They had not expected to face a large, organized fleet. The battle was fierce. Eric rowed until his back and arms burned, propelling the ship forward. When they crashed alongside a Danish ship, he dropped his oar, grabbed his axe and shield, and clambered aboard the enemy vessel. The fighting was close and brutal, but the Norwegians had the advantage of numbers and surprise. The Danish fleet was defeated. Some of their ships were captured, others fled. The ledang fleet had protected the entire region. Eric returned to his farm a few weeks later. He went back to planting his crops and tending his cattle. He was a farmer again. The ledang was an ingenious defensive strategy because it distributed the burden of defense across the entire population. It allowed the coastal communities to project power and to meet threats at sea long before they reached their shores. It was a proactive defense, not a reactive one. It was a recognition that the best way to defend 100 individual farms was with a single, powerful fleet. Number 2 reputation as a shield no axe can break. Egil Skallagrimsson was one of the most famous Vikings of the 10th century. He was a poet, a warrior, a farmer, and a sorcerer. He was also a notoriously difficult and dangerous man. He lived into his old age in Iceland, a remarkable feat for someone who had made so many powerful enemies, including the king of Norway himself. One of Egil's primary defenses was not a wall, a sword, or a law. It was his own fearsome reputation. From a young age, Egil had cultivated an image of unpredictable violence and ruthless efficiency. When he was a boy, he killed another child with an axe over a dispute in a game. As a young man, he bit a man's throat out in a fight. He killed one of King Eric Bloodaxe's sons and then had to compose a magnificent poem, The Head Ransom, to save his own life. The stories of his deeds, both true and exaggerated, spread throughout the Viking world. This reputation became a shield. People were afraid of him. They were afraid to cheat him in trade. They were afraid to raid his farm. They were afraid to challenge him in a dispute. The risk was simply too high. Attacking Egil was not like attacking an ordinary farmer. It meant inviting a blood feud with a man who was known to be tireless, vengeful, and possibly possessed of magical powers. He was known to use runes to curse his enemies. Whether the magic was real or not did not matter. People believed it was real, and that belief affected their actions. In his later years, Egil settled on a farm in Iceland. His farm was prosperous, a tempting target, but it was rarely threatened. A local man named Bjorn once tried to claim a piece of Egil's land. Egil, now old and nearly blind, did not gather men for a fight. He simply walked to Bjorn's farm alone, leaning on a staff. He confronted Bjorn and told him that if he did not drop his claim, Egil would come back and kill him and burn his farm, just as he had done to so many others in his youth. Bjorn knew the stories. He looked at the old blind man and saw the shadow of the great and terrible warrior. He saw the man who had defied kings and slain dozens of men. The threat was credible because of the reputation behind it. Bjorn dropped his claim. Egil's reputation was a proactive defense. It stopped conflicts before they began. It was a form of psychological warfare. He had spent his life building this fearsome persona, and in his old age, it protected him more effectively than a company of housecarls could have. He had made the cost of attacking him seem unacceptably high. This strategy was not unique to Egil. Many Viking chieftains and even ordinary farmers understood the value of a strong reputation. Being known as a tough, fair, but unforgiving person could deter potential aggressors. It meant that you were not seen as an easy target. In a society with no formal police force, where a person's security depended heavily on their own strength and the support of their kin, a reputation for being someone not to be trifled with was one of the most ingenious and enduring defensive strategies of all. It was a shield forged not of iron, but of fear and respect. Number 1. Retreat is a victory when you live to fight another day. The year is 865 AD. A vast Viking army, the Great Heathen Army, has landed in England. It is a force unlike any seen before, a coalition of warbands intent not just on raiding, but on conquest and settlement. A small Anglo-Saxon village near the coast of East Anglia is directly in its path. The village headman is an old man named Leofwine. He has seen Viking raids before, small hit-and-run attacks. This is different. A local rider has brought news of the army's size. It is thousands strong. Leofwine's village has perhaps 40 able-bodied men. They have farm tools, a few hunting spears, and maybe a dozen old shields. They are farmers, not soldiers. Their village is undefended, a collection of wooden huts, and a small church surrounded by open fields. Some of the younger men want to fight. They speak of honor, of defending their homes. Leofwine listens patiently. When they are finished, he speaks. He tells them that honor is a fine thing, but it is useless to a dead man. He tells them that their homes are made of wood and wattle. They can be rebuilt. Their lives and the lives of their wives and children cannot. To stand and fight would not be brave, it would be suicide. They would all be killed and their families would be taken. He proposes a different strategy, retreat. Not a panicked flight, but an organized evacuation. He has a plan. For years, the village has maintained a hidden refuge deep in the nearby fens, a vast and confusing wetland. It is a small, dry island accessible only by a secret path that winds through the reeds and bogs. They have stored some non-perishable food and tools there. The decision is made. They have perhaps half a day before the army arrives. The village becomes a hive of activity. They do not try to pack all their belongings. They take what is most essential and portable. Each family gathers a small amount of food, a few tools, a cooking pot, and their animals. The precious church bells and silver chalice are buried in a secret location. They move quickly and quietly into the fens. It is a difficult journey, especially with the children and the livestock, but they know the way. By the time the vanguard of the great army arrives at the village, it is empty. The hearth fires are cold. The houses are deserted. The Vikings are angry. They had hoped for food, plunder, and a quick victory. They find nothing of value. They burn the empty houses in frustration and move on. They are an army on the move. They do not have the time or the local knowledge to search the vast fens for a few missing villagers. A week later, Leofwine and his people cautiously return. Their village is a collection of charred ruins. It is a heartbreaking sight, but they are all alive. The men, the women, the children, even most of their animals are safe. They have lost their homes, but they have not lost their community. They still have their tools, their skills, and their lives. They can rebuild. Leofwine's decision to retreat was the most effective defensive strategy he could have chosen. He recognized that his goal was not to defend a piece of land or a collection of buildings. His goal was to preserve his people. By refusing to fight an unwinnable battle, he had achieved a strategic victory. He had denied the enemy their prize and had saved his community from annihilation. This understanding that sometimes the bravest and most ingenious defense is to not fight at all was a harsh but vital lesson for survival in a violent age.